Good morning, sir. Can you see and hear us?
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you. May I call Baroness Neville-Rolfe, please?
Of course.
I swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Good morning. My name is Jason Beer, and I ask questions on behalf of the inquiry. Can you tell us your full name, please?
Baroness Lucy Neville-Rolfe.
Thank you. You kindly made a witness statement. It's 72 pages long and is dated the 26th of June 2024. Can we look at that, please? It's WITN 10200100. Can you turn to page 72, please? Is that your signature?
It is indeed, yes.
And are the contents of the witness statement true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
The contents are true. It was signed on the 26th of June when I was a government minister in the Cabinet Office. I'm now an opposition member of the House of Lords.
Yes, thank you. By way of background, I think you were a civil servant for 24 years between 1973 and 1997, is that right?
Yes.
Holding positions, amongst others, as a private secretary, a member of the Prime Minister's policy unit in number 10, and then as a director in the deregulation unit in the then DTI.
Yes.
You then worked in the second stage of your career in the private sector, holding positions as a company secretary, a board member, and as a NED, a non-executive director, including in FTSE-listed companies. Is that right?
That's correct. I was an executive director at Tesco for 15 and a half years, and then I also had a non-executive roles various times.
And then thirdly, you were made a member of the House of Lords in 2013, and from 2014 until 2017, you were a government minister in variously the business, culture, and treasury departments.
Correct.
You held ministerial responsibility for postal affairs, is this right, between the 12th of May 2015 and the 13th of July 2016?
Correct.
So a period of 14 months.
Correct.
I'm going to address matters chronologically, if I may, as you've done in the first part of your witness statement, rather than thematically, because hopefully in this way we will explore all of the themes as they arise across the 14-month period. Can I start, however, with a high-level summary of the entirety of your time in office? It's my summary, and I want to know from you whether I've got it right. I'm going to split it into 4 stages or 4 periods. That may be somewhat artificial, as there was, I think, no neat dividing line in the 4 stages, no light bulb moments, as you say in your witness statement. And the issues appear to have been evolving or developing for you. But is this right? The first period of time, stage 1, lasted from appointment in mid-May 2015 until a meeting with MPs and the Post Office in July, mid-July 2015. And this period, would this be right, would be marked by you being provided with information, principally by ShEx, which information suggested that it was established government policy that government maintained an arm's length approach to the Post Office, that Horizon had been independently and extensively investigated, and that no systemic faults had been found with it.
I think that's a fair summary. I mean, there was also a criminal cases review commission work into cases that people were worried about.
This first stage was marked by you finding that information reassuring and acting in reliance on it.
I think that's largely true, yes.
And accordingly, at this early stage, you followed the orthodox line that you had essentially inherited as part of government policy.
Yes, to the extent I was writing letters to MPs, for example. But obviously, I was aware that there were murmurings, especially amongst a few MPs who had particularly troublesome cases, like the Mrs. Hamilton, I think Miss Hamilton case. And that was one of the reasons I was very pleased that I was going to have a meeting with MPs to discuss some of that.
Thank you. And then stage 2, as I'm going to call it, from mid-July 2015, your faith in ShEx's advice was beginning to wane, and this led to a desire in you to hear from different voices and for more independent scrutiny of the Horizon issues to be undertaken than had been offered by ShEx to date. Is that fair?
That is fair, and I was also in receipt of advice. There was this Second Sight report that was sent to me by one of the MPs, and I was in receipt of advice from ShEx on that, which I was troubled by because it seemed to be a very cursory summary of what looked like a long, complicated report, which I obviously had difficulty in understanding the ins and outs of.
And then stage 3, from about September onwards, you took the view that ShEx were failing to carry into effect your wishes and to an extent seemed to be working against you?
I mean, I think that came a bit earlier, to be honest. I was worried in August that I wasn't getting a broad enough advice. I tried to get in officials without success from the department more broadly. And I also then asked the new chair, Tim Parker of POL, to take a fresh look and undertake an independent review of all of this. So that was actually in the August period. Yeah. But obviously it was carried through later. I mean, in government, things take more time than in the private sector.
And lastly, you determined that the only way forwards was to secure some form of independent investigation into the Horizon issues.
That's correct, yes. And the question was, how could one get this extra work done? Recognising that there were arguments on both sides, of course, because I was being told in all directions that actually there wasn't really an issue. There was no systemic problem with Horizon and so on. So I was trying to find a way through to get some further work done, because I just couldn't believe that these people who seemingly sort of honest, respectable people were, so many of them had been prosecuted, and that was what the MPs had been telling me.
You were engaged in relation to the Post Office for a relatively short period of time, 14 months, whilst you held this ministerial brief. But would this be right? You were concerned by the apparent approach of ShEx officials to align their position very closely with that of the Post Office, rather than exercising an independent function.
Yeah, I think I came to that view gradually, because they were obviously departmental officials, albeit slightly separate, because they were in this thing called the shareholder executive. And in fact, Laura Thompson, who was my main official advice, she seemed, quite like the other officials who worked for me, sounded very satisfactory in other areas. And, she advised me in the classic way. I didn't really realise until later how coordinated that was with the Post Office. Obviously, they needed to go to the Post Office to find out the facts, particularly on individual cases. But I was looking to them for, obviously, the kind of independent, objective advice that, as a former civil servant, I knew was the job of civil servants.
Thank you. With that overview in mind, can we start with your appointment and initial briefing? I think it's right that you were aware, even before you took up the Postal Affairs brief, that concerns had been raised by some MPs about the Horizon issue, and that issue had been raised in Parliament. Is that right?
That is right. And there'd been a debate, and there'd been a piece of correspondence I had, which I got in my bundle originally, about making a statement about mediation, which I'm not sure whether it was eventually made, but the convention is that if a statement is made by a minister in the House of Commons, it's then repeated routinely in the House of Lords, although one doesn't have any influence over the content. Obviously, one's name is put to it, so out of courtesy, it's sent to you to have a look at. So I was aware of that.
So that prior knowledge led you, I think, to, upon receipt of information from the Secretary of State as to the range of your portfolio and the fact that it would include postal affairs, to seek an early meeting about the problems with the Horizon IT system. Is that right?
That's correct, yeah.
Can we look at that, please? It will come up on the screen for you. You can probably put that witness statement to one side now, because I won't be referring to it very often. It will come up on the screen, WITN 10200101. And if we look at page 2 first, please. And scroll down. An email to, and can you help us? The email address is Neville-Rolfe, MPST-old. An email sent to that email address, where would that go to in relation to you?
I mean, that's the private office address. So all your private secretaries have access to that.
And so we shouldn't take any email that's to Neville-Rolfe MPST as being an email that went directly and personally to you?
Correct.
Is it right that you would see some of these emails if private office chose to forward them to you, or to print them and put them in front of you?
Exactly.
Hannah Wiskin, the PPS to the Secretary of State, says the Secretary of State has considered carefully the portfolios across BIS and has decided on policy areas. They're contained in the attached. And if we go to page 1, please. A reply from your private office. If we just scroll down, we can see that it's from Harriet Smith. Harriet Smith, did you have more than one private secretary?
She was the main one, but there's a guy called Andrew,
yes,
who also features, who was the sort of number 2.
Okay, so from your private secretary, Hannah, the minister's broadly content. She's commented as follows. And then about the 5th paragraph down, the post office brief is troubling, and I would like an early meeting on the problems with the Horizon system. Just stopping there, does this look, therefore, like text that has been cut into the email by your private secretary, Harriet, through the use of the word I?
Yes, it does. So most likely I've written that in manuscript on a document that she'd sent me. One of the problems about this particular inquiry is that there isn't any proper paperwork on the private office. This has been preserved, no doubt, because it came from the Secretary of State's office. But I don't think most of the notes of my meetings and the submissions that came and what I wrote on them, that none of that seems to be available. It must have all got thrown away at some point.
Yes.
But this looks very much, that looks like what I said.
Okay.
And then I made this point that obviously I knew that post office closures were a worry, because we dealt with those when some of the post office, as part of transition, some of the post offices were coming into our neighbourhood stores, which I mean was a positive, to be honest.
So you say the post office brief is troubling. I'd like an early meeting on the problems with the Horizon IT system and the losses people are complaining about. This will be a parliamentary issue. Be good to know who will answer on the postal matters in the Commons. I dealt with post office closures a few years ago at Tesco. It was very problematic with local MPs, including David Cameron, whom luckily we were able to help. So this is the 18th of May, within 6 days of you taking up office. Is that right?
That's right, yes.
And the purpose of this part of the email here, was it simply to work out where the parliamentary business would sit as between the Commons and the Lords, i.e. who will actually be speaking in the Commons, or was it a deeper issue you were raising than that?
Well, I think there are a couple of things happening here. First of all, I'm being allocated my portfolios, some of which I was already doing, and which were quite busy, and obviously the bills that I had to do I don't think are mentioned here, though perhaps maybe they are in an annex. Secondly, I knew that taking the post office portfolio wasn't without difficulty. I've recorded that. And then, for good order, I needed to know who would be answering if there were a Commons debate, for example. It turned out to be Minister Freeman in due course. I was always on to this point because I had to answer in the Lords for all my other colleagues. That's one of the sort of challenges of being a Lords minister, just the sheer scale of work that you have to do, which is not in areas that you're responsible for.
I think at the end of the month, at the end of May, you had an introductory meeting with members of ShEx, and that was ahead of a meeting specifically about the post office on the 2nd of June 2015. I think you got a background briefing. Can we turn that up, please? Firstly, the covering email, UK GI 404415. 29th of May, from Laura Thompson. And as you said already, she was your principal contact, is this right, within ShEx?
Yes.
To your private office with the subject of briefing for Baroness Neville-Rolfe, again, ahead of introductory meeting on the post office. Please find attached some background briefing for you ahead of your introductory meeting on Tuesday of next week. Can we turn, please, to the briefing itself? UK GI 404416. This is page 1 of the attachment. It's a 28-page document, and we can't do it justice by going through all 28 pages here. I think you say in your witness statement that overall you found this to be a well-prepared, clear and helpful briefing.
Correct.
Can we look, please, at page 2? This is the first substantive page and is essentially an executive summary. And if we look at the last paragraph on that page, it says a small but vocal number of mostly former sub-postmasters have raised concerns about Post Office's Horizon IT system, which they claim has caused their businesses losses. Over 2 years' worth of independent investigation has found no systemic faults in Horizon. There is a mediation scheme to consider individual cases, but campaigning and media interest persists, and BBC's Panorama is due to broadcast a programme on this on the 22nd of June. See slide 13. If we just, before we go to slide 13, look at page 3, please. Do you see in the bottom left-hand side of that slide, in bold italics, the last entry, government does not seek to influence Post Office's day-to-day operations. Have you got that? That's it.
Yeah, thanks.
And maybe if we just look at it in context, we can see it's essentially a running summary.
Yep.
Was that the orthodoxy that ShEx told you was the essential operating position?
I think they explained, as I probably already knew, that it was at arm's length, and we tried not to interfere because that we were trying to make them behave commercially, and that was how the model worked. And it followed from that we weren't influencing day-to-day operations. I mean, that didn't rule out them asking me, if you look further on in the document, there's a sort of programme of things that I should do as a new minister for the Post Office. And I think that included, certainly I made visits to post offices on visibility. So, but the day-to-day operations, how things run, what the IT system did, which post offices you closed, how rapidly you transformed from the old model to the new model, they regarded that as a matter for the post office. And I mean, I supported that, as I think I've said in my statement, that there can be a lot of merit in allowing, people to get on with it.
I think you say in your witness statement that the model of an arm's length body operation with government is not inherently defective, but it depends on the honesty and reliability and competency of the people operating it.
It does, the people on both sides, yeah.
Can we go to slide 13, which is on page 14, please? This is the slide concerning the Horizon system and the mediation scheme. On the left-hand side, it records that there has been over 2 years of independent scrutiny of the system and no evidence of systemic flaws has been found. And then in the body of the text, if we look at the first paragraph, following complaints from a small number of mostly former sub-postmasters about the system, in 2012, Post Office commissioned an independent firm, Second Sight, to examine the system for systemic flaws that could cause accounting discrepancies. Second Sight's interim report, published in July 13, and the final report, published in April 15, both made clear that there is, and then this is underlined, no evidence of system-wide problems with Horizon. At this time, did you have a copy of either the interim report or the final report that are mentioned here?
I don't think so.
Therefore, did you rely on what was said? In particular, did you rely on what we know to be a false statement, that the final report makes it clear that there was no evidence of system-wide problems in Horizon?
Yeah, obviously I believe that, and that was that line was continuing to be taken for some months by ShEx and no doubt the Post Office.
At this point, you had no information or material to know that that was a false statement insofar as it applied to the final report?
No, and if you look at the pack, it looks considered. They've gone through the various things that are going on. I mean, it looks orderly and well organised.
The rest of the slide concerns the mediation scheme. I'm going to take that as read. I think you asked for a further briefing specifically concerning Horizon. Is that right?
Yes.
And why was that?
I think it probably dated back to that original exchange that we looked at. You remember that I had known on appointment that Horizon was a problem area, and so I think I felt that it was a slightly different subject to the sort of commercial and transformational issues that are looked at the rest of the pack. So it made sense to have a separate session. And I wanted a bit more information. I think they then sent me a longer submission.
We're going to look at that now. UKGI 404453. This is the longer submission, dated the 2nd of June 2015. It is a 6-odd page document. And so the fuller briefing about the Post Office generally was dated the 29th of May. We're now on the 2nd of June. The purpose of this document is recorded to be a further briefing on the Post Office Horizon IT system and associated mediation scheme, and seeking your views on handling this matter in future, with a recommendation that you firstly note the briefing, secondly that you agree that government should maintain distance from this matter and resist calls for further independent investigation, And thirdly, that you agree that officials rather than ministers should respond to future correspondence from the JFSA. Did you, as well as obviously noting the briefing, agree those two recommendations essentially?
I mean, I think certainly the third one, a letter went off to Sir Alan Bates from an official. So implicitly, it's clear that I did agree that. And I think it would fit in with my general approach. You have to look at it in the context of how many portfolios I've got, and therefore how much correspondence and, you know, requests from. It was a request for a meeting, I think, and my general approach was to see if MPs asked to see me, then I would try and have an MP or a fellow peer. And if the department recommended a meeting, particularly if it was from somebody like a trade union, then I would try and fit those in. I was advised, I think, you'd have to go elsewhere in this document, that the justice for sub-postmasters weren't sort of the equivalent of an accredited trade association, state trade union, that they were individuals. And therefore I agreed that it made sense, within the spirit of how we organise correspondence, for that to go from officials.
Can we look at the substance of the briefing then? Paragraph 2. Post Office commissioned an independent firm of forensic accountants, Second Sight, to examine the system for evidence of systemic flaws which could cause accounting discrepancies. The initial report in June 2013 found no evidence of systemic flaws that could cause the issues raised. The report did find that in some cases Post Office could have provided more training and support to sub-postmasters, and Post Office have since made changes to address this. Post Office also established a mediation scheme and invited current and former sub-postmasters to come forward. Then in paragraph 3, there's some numbers given. 136 applicants versus an estimated 68,000 users in 11,700 branches. And the vast majority of sub-postmasters are using Horizon effectively every day. Was that a series of statements that ShEx officials made regularly to you, a comparison of the number of people who had come forwards either to JFSA or through the mediation scheme against the balance of users who were operating the system, it was said, effectively every day?
Yes, certainly that they'd put the numbers in context. But of course the mediation scheme was set up because there were sort of acute problems in a few cases. So, you know, it's important context, but not definitive.
Paragraph 4. Second Sight began their investigations in 2012, producing their initial report in June 13, their final report in April 15. They've also undertaken separate investigations into each of the 136 cases in the scheme. There has therefore been over 2 years of independent scrutiny, and in that time, no evidence of systemic flaws in Horizon has been found. And then if we go forwards to paragraph 7. Despite JFSA's complaints and calls for a new investigation, it is our strong recommendation that government should maintain the position that this is not a matter for government and increase our distance from the matter. Attempts to prolong this matter do damage to Post Office's brand and cost Post Office significant amounts of money in funding Second Sight and operating the mediation scheme. We also recommend that government should resist any calls for further investigation. The matter has been comprehensively investigated over several years, and the complaints of JFSA have borne no fruit. Reinvestigation would be neither value for money nor in the public interest. And then it's repeated, I think for the third time, there is no evidence of systemic flaws in Horizon. Second bullet point, there's no evidence that any of Post Office's prosecutions against sub-postmasters for either false accounting or theft are unsafe. Post Office has got a duty to disclose any new material that comes to light that could support a sub-postmaster's defence, and none has emerged. At this time, had you got any material that suggested to you that that was a false statement?
No, I mean, I knew there were sort of enduring concerns, but I found this reassuring in that the Criminal Cases Review Commission are looking at applications for review from sub-postmasters, and that Paul has a duty, which obviously I was aware of from my corporate background, to disclose material that comes to light. I mean, that's a very important principle of British justice.
But in particular, my question was slightly imprecise. The statement that no material, none, no material has emerged that could support a sub-postmaster's defence. I mean, you now know that by this time, June 2015, much material had emerged within Post Office that might support a sub-postmaster's defence. In particular, you now know, I think, the advice that had been written about the principal expert witness, Gareth Jenkins, that the Post Office had relied on, and the Post Office's own conclusion that he had given evidence that was materially misleading and in breach of his duties to the court. At this time, did you know any of that?
Obviously, I didn't know any of this at this time, or I would have pursued more detail. This is very strong. This is very strong advice. You know, it's not on the one hand, on the other. The ShEx haven't sought to, go into the detail of the individual cases and explain, what the concerns are. I did ask for material on that, but that was later on in August. We'll come to that in due course. As far as I can see here, there's a very strong advice that there isn't a problem. They looked into it all. There is no evidence, and even if there is, and some material comes up, then that's going to be shipped straight off to the Criminal Cases Review Commission. I mean, that would be the way I would have read that. Obviously, we're looking back at hindsight at the moment, and I was getting this unending and, always the same advice on all of these points from ShEx.
Is the point you're making that this, even as a piece of advice, contains no shades of grey? It's very black and white.
Very black and white, yes.
No evidence, no evidence, no evidence.
Correct. So that is what these were civil servants. I've been a civil servant. You have a duty to be objective and truthful as a civil servant. So, obviously, government can't cope if, the civil servants aren't looking at things, honestly, which, of course, they may have been. That, this presumably is what they believed.
Over the page, please. The top bullet point, which picks up a point you made earlier, Baroness Neville-Rolfe. It's important to note that the Federation, which is the recognised representative organisation for sub-postmasters, does not support JFSA's argument. The General Secretary, George Thompson, has publicly said that he considers JFSA members to be, quote, trying it on, and that their complaints are doing damage to sub-postmasters and businesses. Then if we go on to paragraph 8, please. To date, Post Office has generally sought to address JFSA's concerns where possible, and throughout the process has maintained the confidentiality of all members of the scheme, even where individuals have waived their own anonymity and spoken to the press, or where documents have been leaked by JFSA. There's been some media attention on this matter, mostly BBC's The One Show and local news programmes. Subject to taking legal advice, Post Office are now in favour of taking a more robust approach to handling JFSA, given that it is clear JFSA wishes to derail the mediation scheme and prevent the final cases from being mediated. And then lastly, paragraph 13, please. Sorry, I should have read paragraph 8. Sorry, paragraph 9. We consider that a more robust and proactive approach from Post Office, together with a more detached stance from government, would be the right approach to attempt to minimise negative press and ensure the scheme can complete its work and close as swiftly as possible. Are you content with this approach? And I think you've indicated that in the light of what you were told, you would have been content with that approach.
And I think there was I mean, obviously I may have read this afterwards, but the mediation scheme had been subject to a sift originally. And then I think as part of the closing it all down, anybody who wanted to have mediation could have mediation. So, that looked like an improvement to me. And on the trying on, which we passed over rapidly, when I was preparing for today, I discovered that Thompson had actually told the committee in the Commons that he thought that, I think, is it Mr. Ridkin had been trying it on. So there was quite recent evidence, if you like, that no doubt officials were looking at to say that perhaps there was some issue. So that's the background to that. But for me, sitting and looking at all of this, coming, I suppose, as you saw when I first got the role, with a little bit of concern, this seemed to be very, as you said, very strong advice. However, I was a new minister. I didn't really decide anything definitively. We got BBC Panorama coming up, and also a debate, perhaps more important, in the House of Commons.
If we go over the page, please, to paragraph 13. ShEx recommended that correspondence from JFSA is handled at an official level on the basis that they're not a recognised organisation, and that continued direct engagement with ministers will serve to prolong their campaign. We propose to send the response, and there's a draft letter at Annex C from our team. If you prefer to reply personally, we can adapt the response to come from you, or preferably, we can prepare a short response from you, politely declining the offer. Are you content for officials to respond to Mr. Bates? And I think you've indicated that in the light of the draft letter and then the letter that you've seen, the answer was that you were at this stage content for officials to respond.
I felt officials should deal with it. Obviously, I hadn't been given all the background to Mr. Bates, because actually Sir Alan, as he now is, had various sort of interactions with ministers over the years. It would perhaps have been helpful to have known a bit more about that. But that isn't in any of the paperwork.
No.
So
in your
I obviously wasn't aware of it at that time.
Thank you. In your witness statement, you rely on, I think, 5 points to stand up the reasonableness of you relying on the advice given in this submission to you. Can I summarise them and see whether I've got it right? First, ministers are, as a matter of principle, entitled to rely on the advice of officials and do so on the basis that the advice they're receiving is itself objective and thorough. Is that right?
That's certainly my approach, my assumption in dealings with the civil service and the government. Yeah.
Secondly, in this case, the author of this document, Laura Thompson, appeared to you to be both competent and across the detail.
True.
Thirdly, you were new in post, and what you were being asked to do was essentially continue what you were advised was an established government line.
True, and that tends to happen, that you have these established lines which have gone, a lot of work goes into, and as a new junior minister, you inherit those.
Fourthly, the very structure that was embedded was one of an arm's length body which could operate free from political interference, and therefore the approach suggested was consistent with that embedded position.
Correct. I mean, I'm not so sure whether that's not particularly to do with whether you write to Mr. Bates or not, but it's my whole approach to the subject,
yes,
which is to try and allow the Post Office, as well-led as we can make it, to get on and improve things, for the Post Offices, both commercially and for the postmasters. And for society, because the Post Office, this is the thing you've got to remember, the Post Office is so important in almost every village in the land.
And lastly, on the substance, you were informed that there were no systemic problems with the system, despite years of investigation, and that the recognised union supported the Post Office and didn't support the sub-postmasters.
Correct.
In the course of the briefing, it's mentioned that the Post Office prosecuted its own sub-postmasters and that the CCRC was reviewing some cases. You tell us in your witness statement that you took comfort from the fact that the CCRC was considering some convictions and that Post Office had agreed to preserve documents accordingly. When were you first aware that the Post Office conducted its own prosecutions?
I think I would have been aware of that probably even before I took over, because there are various bits of government that, private prosecutions can be done by organisations. And the Post Office did their own in the same way as something like the DVLA or the RSPCA, which isn't even a government body.
So you were aware even before you took up this post as to Post Office's private prosecutorial function?
It isn't something I queried. I did in my statement at the end question whether it should have continued in quite the way it did once you've moved from a public sector organisation to a more private sector one. But that's a completely different point, perhaps for later. Obviously, I knew that they were doing that. But obviously, they had a large legal department, no doubt inherited from the conglomerate that was originally Royal Mail plus the Post Office. And indeed, I think we discovered elsewhere that they'd recently put in charge a new general counsel, which sounded like a good idea at the time.
Did you have any concerns, therefore, that the Post Office had a private prosecution function?
No, I don't think I'd have concerns in particular at the private prosecution function, although with the benefit of hindsight and knowing what I now know, I think it's important that institutions like that, the thing about this, I'm perhaps anticipating, but the thing about the CPS, when they took over from the police, is that the CPS can look in the round in all these cases and say, is this sensible? Now, there's no reason why the Post Office couldn't have done that themselves. And they have, obviously, if you're a prosecutor, you have to abide by various codes and behave properly and look at evidence and worry about disclosure. So all of that can be done by the Post Office. But as I've said elsewhere, that once you're a private operation, the incentives are slightly different. And so that would be the worry. But you're asking me, at that time, the fact that they did private prosecutions, I noted, I think I knew about it. And in any event, they've got audit committees and all the rest of it to look at, at the progress of legal cases and prosecutions, which I obviously knew about from having been a non-executive director and indeed an executive director in lots of companies. Prosecution policy is something, that you would routinely take a look at, make sure it was being done properly.
And you're referring to your time in...
At Tesco, but also in other companies where I've sat on the audit committee.
And did Tesco have a prosecution policy?
We certainly prosecuted quite a lot of shoplifters and so on. And we would have, the compliance committee would have, obviously, from time to time, would look at the number of cases, and the security officer would come and talk to us about that sort of thing.
And was that a function of the audit and compliance or audit and risk committee?
We didn't have a risk committee. We had an audit committee which was made up of non-executive directors, but I attended in my capacity as company secretary. And then we also had an executive compliance committee, which during the period I was company secretary, I used to chair. So, I was knowledgeable about that sort of thing.
And just help us, it's, the document can come down from the screen. It may be an interesting point of comparison. What level of scrutiny in a fully private company, Tesco's, was given in that committee to prosecution?
I think it would tend to look at numbers, but if you had a sort of difficult case, and arguably what we're talking about here were quite a lot of difficult cases with publicity, then they would have been looked at by by non-executive committees as well as executive committees. And we'd have a sort of legal annex. And I've had that in other companies which I've chaired or sat on as a board. You would know what was going on in the legal area, and that would be a combination of tribunals, prosecutions, etc.
You mentioned that did you say security director would come and report to you?
Yeah.
And what would he or she report?
Well, they write a paper on these are the things that have happened over the last year or 6 months or whatever the period was. And, you know, we've had prosecutions and successful or unsuccessful, and we've nagged away at the Home Office to help a bit more and all that sort of stuff.
Thank you. You tell us, and you mentioned it a moment ago, at paragraph 290 of your witness statement, that the arrangements allowing the Post Office to pursue their own prosecutions excuse me, should have been ended at privatisation when they cease to be part of government. Prosecution decisions should be made independently and impartially, whereas here there were financial incentives for prosecuting. Firstly, I take it that's a view that's emerged after your time in office.
Correct.
In the light of the events which have happened and have
Correct.
been revealed. But secondly, why do you draw the link between the ending of the prosecution function and the event of privatisation?
Well, I think, obviously, if you're a governmental body, it's fair enough that if there is fraud or harassment or whatever, that, you know, you would have a legal department and that could bring prosecutions, or you could take them to the CPS if you wanted them to do it. I think once you've privatised it, a whole thing, you've got to set up. You've got to have a proper legal department. And as I said, I think it must have been split between the two bodies. And in a commercial operation, especially where there seemed to be some sort of benefit to the Post Office from the prosecutions, in that, you know, the money. They were recovering money, which then goes into their bottom line, or it was sitting in an account. Then there's a slight conflict. There's a sort of slight inherent conflict of interest would be my concern. So either you could stop prosecuting, and I think they did stop prosecuting all the Horizon-related ones before I even took over. I think I may have checked that. So it's important that either you don't prosecute and you get the CPS to do it, or you set up a proper system of kind of reviewing the cases to make sure that you're learning from mistakes. And in a commercial company like the ones I was used to, you know, learning from mistakes was one of the big features that a compliance committee would always look at. You know, have we done it this right way? You lost a case. You know, why was that? Or there seems to be an awful lot of these different things. I remember, for example, on slips and trips in stores, we actually changed the whole system because we discovered we were having a great many cases on that, and people perhaps slipping over, hurting their foot, and then coming back and taking a legal case against us, which took ages. So we changed the whole system so that remedies could actually be addressed straight away in the store, that you would apologise to the person, take them home, send them flowers, if necessary, give them some sort of minor element of compensation. And that stopped us. It's an example of learning from mistakes. It stopped us having so many cases, and you know, customers getting a remedy much more quickly.
You mentioned that by the time that you were in office, the Post Office had stopped prosecuting cases based on Horizon. Mm-hmm. Did you know that at the time?
I mean, I'm not sure when I learnt it, but I did find that out. So given there was an uncertainty, which became more and more apparent as we went through the year, that was obviously good news that they weren't continuing. But one had got these outstanding cases, which were before the Criminal Cases Review Board. So that was obviously a sensible thing to do.
Was it revealed to you that the reason that the Post Office stopped prosecuting, or the reasons included, that the Post Office could not find any expert witness who would testify as to the integrity of Horizon or the data that it produced?
No, I wasn't aware of that until this inquiry.
We saw that the
prosecutions, Mr. Beer. Can I just? It's a very minor point, but I'm wanted to be clear about it. When you were talking about your time at Tesco, Baroness, you said we prosecuted shoplifters. Just so that I'm clear, do you mean by that Tesco took out private prosecutions, or do you mean you reported them to the police, who then instigated a prosecution via the CPS?
It's a very good question, Sir Wynne, which I'd like to come back to you on, because I wouldn't want to mislead you. I mean, obviously, prosecutions were taking place.
Sure.
The individual detail of who exactly did it. There weren't as many prosecutions as I know many store managers wanted, which perhaps suggests to me we were using CPS rather than doing it ourselves. But perhaps I could come back to you on that point,
Yes,
if that's permitted.
Yeah, of course it is. Thank you.
Thank you. We saw very briefly that the second annex to the briefing note of the 2nd of June 2015 was the draft letter to Alan Bates declining a meeting with you. And you accepted the advice that you should decline the meeting and therefore didn't meet him. You had, however, been asked to meet Paula Vennells, by this time the CEO of the Post Office. Is that right?
Yes, the original briefing had a sort of table of things that I should do as minister, and that included meeting the CEO, which seemed very sensible.
That meeting occurred relatively early in your period in office. It was the 11th of June, I think, 2015, and you received a briefing for it 2 days beforehand on the 9th of June. Can we look at that, please? It is UKGI 401074. Uh, 9th of June, again, it's from Laura Thompson to you for a meeting on the 11th of June. You'll see the proposed attendees additionally included Al Cameron, Kevin Gilliland and Mark Davis. Tim McInnes from ShEx would also attend. Under background, this is your first meeting with Paula Vennells since you became the Minister for the Post Office. Paula has tended to meet with ministers 2 or 3 times a year. It says that she will want to give you an overview, will also want to discuss the away day. And then over the page, please. Main issues to discuss. I'm going to speed through these: long-term strategy, financial performance, network transformation, banking. And then over the page, Horizon. Paula may want to reassure you that Post Office are handling the issues relating to the mediation scheme set up in connection with their IT system, particularly the forthcoming BBC Panorama programme. It remains the case that there is no evidence of systemic fault within the IT system. We have communicated to Post Office that the government maintains that the mediation scheme and cases within it are independent of government. Post Office are supportive of that approach. So essentially a repetition of the briefing that we saw in the 2nd of June 2015 pack. Now, there is no surviving minute of this meeting, we're told. Have you any reason to believe that the meeting didn't track the briefing, and therefore, firstly, Horizon formed only a small part of your discussion, and secondly, that you weren't told anything other than is set out here?
Yeah, I mean, on Horizon, this would be my recollection of what I was told by Paula and others from Pol at that time, and the meeting will have, I think, was more wide-ranging. I think we talked. I was interested in the transformation, the commerce, how they were going to retail, more general issues, and the premium bonds. Where at some stage I remember agreeing to go and see the Treasury Minister very unsuccessfully to get the Treasury to continue to use post offices for selling some of their products.
Thank you. Can we move forwards in the chronology then to the BBC Panorama programme, the adjournment debate, which eventually led to a meeting between MPs and the Post Office. Can I use your witness statement to track this part of the chronology, please? Page 12, paragraph 46. paragraph 46 is at the foot of the page, and you say on the 24th of June 2015, Laura Thompson sent a submission to both me and George Freeman regarding a BBC Panorama programme that was due to be broadcast on the 29th of June, although in fact it didn't air until the 17th of August. This was timed to coincide with an adjournment debate called by Andrew Bridgen, MP, and the submission indicated that both Mr. Bridgen and James Arbuthnot were understood to be involved in its making. It stated that the programme was expected to be highly critical of Post Office. Ms. Thompson again implies that Horizon, quote, is a matter for the Post Office and sub-postmasters, and it would be inappropriate for government to intervene. And then over the page, please. Paragraph 47, the Post Office had fallen within my portfolio for around 7 weeks by this time, and I could see a pattern emerging. It was the consistent advice of ShEx that these matters were independent of government, that Post Office was dealing with the various matters appropriately, and on Horizon, there was no evidence of any systemic problem despite rigorous independent testing, and that I should not be interfering. Then if we go further down the page to paragraph 50, you say, although you didn't see it at the time, I've since been provided with a letter dated the 26th of June from Paula Vennells to George Freeman in advance of the adjournment debate, in which he states that Post Office had gone to, quote, great lengths to investigate the problems with Horizon, and that, quote, the past 3 years have underlined the confidence we've always had in Horizon. It has been found to work as it should, end quote. Ms. Vennells set out in her letter that Post Office had found nothing to suggest that any conviction was unsafe, and that Post Office took great care regarding its continuing duty of disclosure on all legal matters, including full cooperation with the CCRC. This was of a piece with the information I was being provided by ShEx. We now know, of course, that it was seriously misleading. Moving on, you tell us in paragraph 51 that on the 29th, Andrew Bridgen called an adjournment debate. A number of MPs raised constituents' complaints, and Mr. Bridgen stated that he and a number of colleagues had lost all faith and trust in the Post Office's willingness to investigate the issue. He criticised the mediation scheme and called for a public inquiry. George Freeman referred to the striking degree of concern expressed by parliamentarians at and in the lead-up to the debate, excuse me, and offered to convene a meeting between MPs and Post Office executives in which the issues could be discussed. And then moving on, please, to paragraph 52. You say that I understood that at least some postmasters were losing or had lost trust and confidence in the mediation scheme, whilst at this time, ShEx officials were telling me that, quote, the Post Office has put a great deal of effort to be helpful and transparent here, yet are constantly denounced for their approach and apparent contempt for MPs without any real evidence to demonstrate why. They accept the seriousness of the situation and are committed to resolving it, but are becoming increasingly frustrated by the attacks. You say, I was keen to preserve the mediation scheme, see the CCRC reach conclusions, and encourage engagement between sub-postmasters and Post Office. I agree with George Freeman that the way forward was to bring the interested parties together and at least provide a forum for open, frank and sensible discussion. That wouldn't have happened had you followed ShEx advice. Can I look at the exchange in which you agreed with Mr. Freeman's approach, WITN 10200103, please. And can we start with page 3, please? And there's an email of the 1st of July from Laura Thompson to your private office and Mr. Freeman's private office, amongst others. Can we see that? And Ms. Thompson says, Andrew, he was one of you, those that worked in your private office, the person you referred to earlier, is that right?
Yes.
Please see attached submission sent to the pair of you. It follows up on Monday's adjournment debate in the Commons on the Post Office Horizon system, which is Baroness Neville-Rolfe's policy lead, but the debate was taken by George Freeman. The submission recommends how we meet the commitment made by government and repeated at Prime Minister's questions today to convene a meeting on this matter. There are draft letters for you to send to Andrew Bridgen MP, who called the debate, and Paula Vennells, Post Office CEO. And then if we go to the bottom of page 2, please. Thank you. Can you explain who the email is from and to here?
So that's to me, myself, from my private secretary.
So Andrew Smith, your private...
Attaching a submission, yeah.
Andrew Smith, your private secretary, using your private office email address, sending it to you in a personal email, is that right?
In a personal email, probably my parliamentary account, but obviously
yes,
it's not clear from there. Yeah.
Minister, please find attached a submission on the Horizon adjournment debate outlining next steps. Officials are keen for the draft letters to issue ASAP. Skipping a paragraph, George Freeman's comments, as relayed by his private office, are: the Minister considered your advice and he is somewhat content. However, he feels strongly that Second Sight and George Thompson, NFSP, should be invited. He commented that the MPs focused on Second Sight and it would not be a satisfactory meeting without them. He agrees that JFSA should not attend. So here you're being told that there's a submission including draft letters to go out to Paula Vennells and Andrew Bridgen, who called the debate, that this has been run past your colleague in the Commons, George Freeman, and he said that he felt strongly that Second Sight should be invited to attend the proposed meeting, correct?
Correct.
And then if we scroll up, please. Mr. Smith writing to you about half an hour later on the same day, saying that he had just had a call from officials who recommend strongly that Second Sight are not invited to the meeting. So officials in this context, would that be from ShEx?
Yeah.
So far we've got Mr. Freeman and his antennae may be twitching a little by him saying, I think it's important. I strongly believe that Second Sight should attend this meeting. ShEx recommending strongly that they're not, to your private office. And then you reply about an hour later, we can see it at the top there, I'm uneasy about overruling George Freeman and I'm not sure about excluding others. So at this point, officials were trying to persuade you to exclude Second Sight from the proposed meeting. Your ministerial colleague and you disagreed.
I disagreed, although in the end, I think I agreed to a meeting without Second Sight. But
we'll see that develop.
We'll soon come on to that because they went on nagging away at it, and I was keen to get the meeting to happen. Anyway, perhaps we can. But that's right. I was uneasy, you know. But then they had reasons, which presumably we'll come on to.
And if we scroll up, please. your private secretary sends your reply back to ShEx, in particular Laura Thompson, and then scroll up, please. And then a little further, about an hour later, a long email from Laura Thompson. So she's called in, or somebody from ShEx has called in, saying, we think it's a bad idea that Second Sight are invited to this meeting. And then this is followed up by a long email, we'll see, taking the same point. Laura Thompson says, I understand the Minister's concerns about excluding people and that George Freeman is in favour of inviting Second Sight because MPs focused on them. However, I would still recommend strongly that they're not invited to the meeting. The legal risk to Post Office and potentially government is significant if this meeting prejudices the work of the CCRC. So at this point, ShEx had an attempt to exclude Second Sight by calling your private office, and they're trying again in this email and raise a point that there's said to be a significant risk to the Post Office, legal risk to the Post Office, and indeed to government by prejudicing the work of the CCRC by meeting Second Sight. Did you or do you understand the logic of that position?
I mean, I don't know what I thought at the time, but what I would say is if I'm told that something prejudices the work of the Criminal Cases Review Commission, I take that seriously. And clearly officials who at that time I had no reason to believe were not doing anything that wasn't in my own interest were saying that we shouldn't have Second Sight. And it seemed to me that the key thing was to see the MPs and hear what they got to say and to get them to actually talk to the Post Office, because there seemed to be something of a standoff between these MPs and the Post Office, which was why I was keen to have a meeting and hoped that it would be constructive. Perhaps over-optimistic at the time, but that was my approach.
Ms Thompson continues, we have very grave concerns that based on Second Sight's conduct to date, they will not respect confidentiality or the terms of their engagement during either the meeting or afterwards. We understand, although cannot confirm, that they have links into JFSA and strongly believe their presence in the meeting will do more harm than good. And then she adds a second point, that the Post Office are extremely worried about the risk to their business from this meeting, particularly around legal issues like the CCRC. I'd be concerned that inviting Second Sight could be a red line for them. We'd have to consider what would happen if this were the case. I think it's important to remember Post Office have put in a great deal of effort to be helpful and transparent here, and yet are constantly denounced for their approach and their apparent contempt for MPs without any real evidence to demonstrate why. They accept the seriousness of the situation and are committed to resolving it, but are becoming increasingly frustrated by the attacks against them. It's not clear what more they could do, remembering, as we mentioned to the Minister, Post Office are effectively fighting with one hand behind their back because they're respecting confidentiality when others are not. And so this is taking a separate point, never mind the merits of the situation. The Post Office might consider this a red line, and this is another reason to exclude Second Sight.
Yeah, I think the main point is about prejudicing criminal work somewhere else or civil work somewhere else. Obviously, this is perhaps the first example of Post Office, of ShEx very much taking strongly a Post Office line and bringing that through, which is interesting. But I took the view that we'd promised a meeting. The meeting promise had been repeated by the then Prime Minister, David Cameron, and that I was keen to meet the MPs and talk to them about their concerns and, you know, not actually having Second Sight present. That didn't seem to me to be a killer point. The key point was to get on and have the meeting. You could always have another meeting with Second Sight on another occasion, if that's what turned out to be necessary.
Thank you.
But I mean, I have to say, in a busy day, this is going backwards and forwards. It was probably, a snap judgment. Let's get on. Let's have the meeting. And let's invite the post office to come, although they didn't, in fact, send the CEO, which was a disappointment to me, as you'll see from later documents.
And we're going to come to that after the break. Before we do, can we see what happened by looking at your witness statement, page 16? Paragraph 58, please. Much as you told us, you say, the key thing from my perspective was to get the MPs together in a room with Paula Vennells and Post Office executives and to hear what they had to say. I was aware the relationship between Post Office and Second Sight was not healthy and thought it would be easier to get Ms Vennells to attend if they were not there. I also took at face value the concern that Second Sight presented a risk of leaking what was said at the meeting, and also thought it important to avoid the meeting descending into a discussion of individual cases. The point was to have a productive discussion between MPs and Post Office senior management as part of a process to get to the bottom of the matter, and it seemed most likely that that would happen without Second Sight at this stage. And then you tell us you did later subsequently meet with Messrs Warmington and Henderson. So some letters went out. Can we look at those, please? UKGI 404820. A letter of the 2nd of July to Andrew Bridgen, and scrolling down. Thank you. Just a little bit further. Further up. I'm writing as the Minister responsible. Further to the adjournment debate, I'd like to follow up the offer of George Freeman by inviting you to attend a meeting at the department to discuss the matter. You mention in the next paragraph the mediation scheme and confidentiality and the importance of maintaining it. In the third paragraph, the fact that the CCRC has received applications from individuals in the scheme. Paragraph 4, you say that the government acknowledges the concerns of MPs raised during the adjournment debate. Paragraph 5, the government wants to ensure that MPs take the opportunity to raise their concerns directly with the Post Office. At the same time, the government would like to allow the Post Office a further opportunity to address the very serious accusations that have been made against it. The meeting will provide an opportunity for both MPs and the Post Office to understand each other's views better while maintaining the confidentiality of individual cases and respecting the work of the CCRC. And then over the page, it will be a private meeting, and I'll be writing in similar terms to the Post Office to invite them to attend. And then can we look at poll 302-7164? A letter on the same day to Paula Vennells, the CEO of the Post Office. And if we just scroll down, you'll see that it's in very similar terms. So an equivalent letter. Both letters were in fact silent, I think, on the issue of Second Sight attendance.
I think they did say we might have another meeting or something on a future. I mean, there's possibility. It was silent. I think if you go over, keep going.
See if we scroll down a little further.
Yeah, I thought. Yeah, following the meeting, consider whether any additional further action or meetings are required. I think I kind of might put that in. I can't remember, but
no.
that.
But it doesn't explicitly say
It doesn't
Second Sight
explicitly
will or will not.
It doesn't say Second Sight are being invited. It doesn't say Second Sight aren't being invited. But it's trying to set up a constructive conversation, try and get the two sides a little bit closer together.
Can we look at the reply from Paula Vennells, UKGI 6026? Her reply of the 10th of July to you. Thank you for your letter of the 2nd. Post Office is, of course, willing to attend a meeting to discuss these matters, and I note that it's been set up for Wednesday. Unfortunately, this coincides with a Post Office board meeting. Therefore, I hope you'll accept my apologies. My colleagues, Mark Davis, Communications and Corporate Affairs Director, and Patrick Bork, who leads the Post Office team dealing with the scheme, will be pleased to attend, and that you found some time to speak on Tuesday morning in advance of the meeting. Ms Vennells continues, as you know, we have been open and transparent with MPs throughout this important process, and have met Mr Bridgen previously with some of his fellow MPs. Regrettably, it's clear our engagement has done little to address his concerns. Since the last meeting, Mr Bridgen has on 3 occasions refused our offer of a further meeting, most recently last week. We've also offered every MP with a constituent in the scheme the opportunity to discuss the case with us, subject to consent. Just 3 MPs have taken up the offer. Over the last 3 years, Post Office has been trying to address a small number of individual private complaints brought to it by mostly former sub-postmasters about problems they experience whilst working in their post offices. Despite the finding of an initial investigation that our computer system did not suffer from systemic flaws, we've established a scheme. All cases have been comprehensively re-investigated and independently reviewed, and all of this work has been shared with individual applicants. It's worth reiterating, in none of the cases has our computer system been shown to have caused the losses complained of, and in none of the cases has any evidence emerged to suggest convictions are unsafe. And over the page. Instead, in a majority of cases, it's clear from the evidence that errors made in branch are responsible for the problems that arose. In some other cases, Post Office acknowledges it might have done more to support individual sub-postmasters. In a last group of cases, thankfully a minority, regrettably, sub-postmasters have committed criminal offences, either by dishonestly covering up losses or stealing or both. Skipping a paragraph, in cases involving a criminal conviction, our investigations reveal that the facts on which the convictions were based cannot be distinguished from the issues raised by applicants in the scheme. Therefore, mediation is not appropriate, as it's not capable of producing the principal outcome sought, because only the courts can overturn a conviction. Skipping a paragraph, as you note, a number of these applicants have asked the CCRC to look into their cases, and it would be highly inappropriate to do anything which might interfere with their work. In short, applicants to the scheme have a choice to sit down and mediate their cases with the Post Office, litigate in the civil courts, or pursue any claim for miscarriage of justice through the established processes. Given these clear choices, it is not immediately clear what the Post Office could offer beyond restating the choices. However, we'll try to address as many of the concerns expressed by MPs as we can. Finally, and whilst you do not mention them in your letter, there have been suggestions that Second Sight should attend a meeting, as Second Sight has no standing in the dispute between the Post Office and applicants. We do not consider their involvement to be necessary or appropriate. So Ms Vennells seems emphatic that you and the MP should not meet Second Sight, yes?
Certainly she doesn't want Second Sight at that meeting.
We know that by this time, Post Office knew that there were bugs, errors and defects within the Horizon system, and that Second Sight had discovered some of those bugs. We know that the Post Office by this time knew that forms of remote access by Fujitsu to the system were possible, including a form of remote access by which financial data at branch level could be amended by the insertion of transactions into an account without the sub-postmaster's knowledge, and that Second Sight, on the basis of some whistleblower evidence, had discovered some of this. We know that by this time the Post Office knew that its principal expert witness in criminal prosecutions was said to have breached his duties to the court and to have given misleading evidence to the court, but the Post Office had decided not to reveal that information either to Second Sight or to convicted defendants. Did you know any of those things?
I didn't know any of those things, no. But I'd also note that Paula Vennells didn't come to the meeting. I suppose if she knew, and she's written this letter, which certainly, if that was known to her, it's odd that there's absolutely no suggestion of any hesitation or concern on any of those points at that point in time. But she didn't come. She sent the Mr. Davis, who was communications person.
And Mr. Bork, the
Mr.
corporate affairs director.
Well, at that time, I remember that, I asked who was this person, and I was told, well, he was the person in charge of the mediation scheme. But actually, you're describing him, I think later he's described as the government affairs director.
Yes.
Whereas obviously my hope would have been that Paula Vennells herself would have turned up so that one could have made some progress, rather than people who are, as it were, managing the MPs and managing, even trying to manage the ministers. So that was, I think, regrettable.
We've seen the reason that Paula Vennells gave for not being able to attend was a diary clash.
That's what that says, and that's what I took at face value.
Yes.
Although
Have you seen information since then?
Well, I think somebody mentioned to me, but I can't give you chapter and verse, that actually there was advice that she shouldn't attend the meeting, which is exactly a slightly different point. Clearly, I understand the importance of board meetings. I don't know what the exact timing clash was.
Let's just look at that, please. Poll 0038 8295. And look at page 2 first, please. And if we just scroll down, please. Please see attached that's just arrived. That's your letter. I assume we should seek to respond quickly. It's still my view that Paula should not attend, but should perhaps speak to Baroness Neville-Rolfe beforehand. I'm very open to contrary views. That's Tom Weschler, Miss Vennells, then Chief of Staff. And then scroll up, please, to see what the Communications Director said. I agree, the Paula point. This was also her view when we spoke this morning. And I also agree that she should speak to her in advance. I think that means I agree that Paula Vennells should speak to Baroness Neville-Rolfe in advance. I suggest we reply as warmly as possible, especially as the letters from you. And then scroll up, please. I share the view, Paula, says Patrick Bork. And then scrolling up, please. Tom Weschler again agrees, attendees. And I think that's the end of it. So at the time, you wouldn't be aware, presumably, that various Post Office PR and communications people were providing advice behind the scenes to Paula Vennells that she should not attend the meeting with you. You took at face value what was said in her letter, that she had a diary clash.
I took it entirely at face value, and of course it's a board meeting, and you do try to respect, if you're director, you do try to make sure you do go to board meetings. So it was a perfectly valid excuse, but I was somewhat perturbed when I subsequently saw this, that actually it was strategic rather than a diary clash. because I think having her there would have been good, because she would have had to listen to the MP's concerns and answer them herself.
Thank you. So that's an appropriate moment for the morning break. Could we break until 25 past, please?
Yes, certainly.
Thank you, sir. Good morning, sir. Can you continue to see and hear us?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Baroness Neville-Rolfe, can we turn briefly to what happened at the meeting between Post Office and the MPs? Is it right that you essentially chaired or facilitated the meeting?
Yeah, I chaired it, as would be normal with a ministerial meeting.
Can we turn to page 17 of your witness statement, please? And look at the foot of page 17. Paragraph 62, you say the meeting between MPs and Post Office was attended by Andrew Bridgen, Kevin Jones, they're the MPs, Mark Davis, Patrick Borg, Laura Thompson, and you. And a note was drafted by Ms. Thompson. You give the reference to it. I'm going to use your witness statement instead to address what happened. You say the note records that Messrs. Bridgen and Jones outlined their concerns relating to some individuals. The concerns focused on the length of time the issue had been ongoing and the view of the MPs that Post Office had acted with a lack of transparency in dealing with the claims, that there had been problems with Horizon, the way in which Post Office had used its powers of prosecution, the length of time it took for cases to progress through the mediation scheme, concerns about miscarriages of justice where individuals have been advised to plead guilty to false accounting by their legal representatives. I also believe they raised concerns about document destruction. 63, I recall thinking that the concerns expressed by Andrew Bridgen and Kevin Jones needed to be taken extremely seriously. You say, skipping a paragraph, this meeting, which took place within 2 months of my taking up the postal affairs role, was an important step. Amongst other things, it brought home that the processes in place, including mediation and the CCRC process, were not working satisfactorily. More generally, I was from the start surprised that so many people excuse me, from normally reliable sections of the community were being convicted of dishonesty. This was troubling. On that last sentence there, can you explain more generally what you meant, please?
As I got into the individual cases, which earlier on I'd been discouraged from thinking about, it became apparent that these were honest citizens who perhaps had, on retirement, you buy a post office, I'm not quite sure what the arrangements are. People like Lord Arbuthnot's constituency, I think it's in Hampshire, leafy, middle-class people, who suddenly, out of the blue, with no even suggestion that they had either themselves or any of their friends and relations been involved in anything dishonest, were suddenly ending up in court and being convicted. Mainly, I think, on grounds of false accounting, but in some cases of theft. And that I'd got all this evidence that everything was fine, that there was nothing wrong, that there'd been an independent inquiry which actually told us that the Post Office was right. And yet, the people who were, as it were, going down were terribly honest citizens. I have to say, this is the thing that worried me. I've come from business, and I'd also come from the civil service. And it's not only keeping the business going; it's having an element of common sense and thinking about your staff. So that was what worried me. But I didn't actually have any information to support my case until I had this meeting and Andrew Bridgen and Kevin Cavan started to, list some of these points. That was my sort of road to Damascus, if you like, beginning to realise that there were quite small numbers. We were talking about, I think, about three or four MPs at that time who'd had these very unsatisfactory experiences with what I call Middle Britain.
Thank you. Can I check with you whether a couple of issues were addressed at the meeting? By firstly looking at poll 302-7729. Which is an email, you wouldn't have seen this at the time, it's internal to Post Office, from Mark Davis on the 15th of July at 17 minutes past 8 in the evening to, amongst others, Jane McLeod, Paula Vennells, Angela Vanden Bogart. And he says, if we scroll down, Patrick and I met with Andrew Bridgen and Kevin Jones today at a meeting chaired by you. The meeting was held up as Mr. Jones was late. Mr. Bridgen then ran through his central points. This included no new allegations and was broadly a repeat of his adjournment debate script. He raised some new unnamed cases. He accused the Post Office of abusing its prosecution powers and using plea bargaining to cajole people into accepting guilty pleas, curtailing Second Sight's work and the mediation scheme, reducing the scope of Second Sight's work and forcing Second Sight to moderate its reports, not cooperating with Second Sight, and then this having a Dickensian contract arrangement with postmasters, a suspicious suspend account procedure, and an inadequate helpline. Have you any recollection that the contract itself, said to be Dickensian, which was rather prophetic because that's how the Court of Appeal was subsequently to describe it in similar terms many years later, whether that was raised?
Well, I have no reason to believe that it wasn't. After all, it's on a memo from Pol saying what came up which disturbed them. And clearly, I probably knew at the time that the way it works is that a sub-postmaster is almost like is a kind of agent responsible for all their, for everything that they do, and that was no doubt incorporated into the contract. It's a very one-sided arrangement, but then I think, to be fair, post offices entered into that knowing that it was a one-sided arrangement and thinking that they would be able to cope with that, because often they had a lot of experience of running small businesses and things when they took over post offices. You didn't become a sub-postmaster overnight. There was some sort of, I assume, there was some sort of vetting procedure before you actually got given the keys to Horizon.
So did you know about the one-sided nature of the contract at the time?
Well, I think I knew after this meeting. It wasn't referred to in any of the briefing that I'd had prior to that from ShEx that I've noticed. But I mean, obviously it's difficult for me to remember 10 years hence when I learned what I learned. But it was a sort of, I was gradually learning from listening to these outsiders what their problems were. And one of the problems was the contract arrangements. And of course I know now, because I've been given information about what eventually happened, that the contract was a key issue in the Fraser judgment.
And lastly, Mr. Bridgen accused the Post Office of using Bracknell and remote access to target and implicate postmasters of wrongdoing. And then Kevin Jones endorsed the above, accused the Post Office of using the mediation scheme as a smokescreen to pass the statute of limitations, a deliberate and planned cover-up, leaning on Second Sight, and gagging Panorama. he accused Patrick and I of lying to him and Mr. Bridgen in the meeting. We did not. The MPs asked the Minister to call an independent inquiry to meet with Second Sight. They asked us to provide details of how much we paid out to settle claims. We agreed, over the page, to write to both MPs, reiterating our offer to meet. It was a very unpleasant meeting at which Patrick and I were robust but respectful in making our case in the face of an approach which was volatile and at times aggressive. Do you remember these two MPs being volatile and aggressive?
To be honest, this isn't my note of the meeting, and I didn't see it at the time. And if I had, I think that was probably a little bit unfair on them. They were actually explaining clearly what their concerns were in detail, which frankly was exactly what I wanted in having the meeting.
Scrolling down under comment, Mr. Davis says, this was a very difficult meeting. We now need to ensure that the Minister, that's you, understands the position. While she was supportive, there's a risk that the complexity of the issue, plus MP interpretation of that complexity, causes the search for simple solutions, which we know do not exist. And then the foot of the page, second paragraph up, the Minister did appear to agree that it would be rather difficult to make progress if the MPs refuse to engage with the rest of the story. Can you recall what commitments you made, if any, at the conclusion of the meeting?
I'm sure I will have said that I would reflect further, because that would have been standard practice. And I think I encouraged the MPs to talk to the post office, because there's been the standoff between them, and it looks from this as though there was some acceptance by Mr. Bridgen. There was also a point about documents. There seemed to be concern that documents were being shredded, which would be helpful to the unfortunate people who've been prosecuted. And I do recall, I don't know whether, probably as a result of this meeting, that I took some steps to do something about that, because obviously given my commercial background, I was very aware of the importance of not shredding documents, even very old documents, and of your legal duty, particularly if you were an actual trained lawyer, you know, a barrister or a solicitor, not to check documents. So I think I recall that coming out of it. And obviously, I went away and, you know, wanted further meetings to discuss what might be done.
Thank you. That can come down. You tell us in your witness statement that at about this time, it's paragraph 65, no need to turn it up, all of the advice I was receiving regarding Horizon was from ShEx. This was supposed to be impartial and balanced. However, my faith in that advice was beginning to wane. I now wanted to hear different views and wanted to apply some more independent scrutiny to the issue than had been offered to date by ShEx. And at that meeting, I agreed with Andrew Bridgen that I should meet with James Arbuthnot MP. Was this meeting, therefore, one of the turning points in the unfolding picture?
Definitely. I think the MPs played an important role, you know, in articulating the issues and articulating the problems in a way that perhaps the experts, Second Sight and things, were not able to do. And I think James Arbuthnot was probably may have been invited to the original meeting and hadn't been able to come, I don't know. But it became apparent from that meeting how important and pivotal he was. So I was obviously keen to talk to him, and I did later meet him. And, you know, he's played a crusading role in all of this.
Can we see what ShEx's follow-up was to the meeting by looking at UKGI 301 5226? This is the 17th of July, so 2 days later. The purpose says Ms. Thompson is following your meeting, is the next steps following your meeting on Wednesday. with the MPs, with a recommendation that the Post Office, that you note that the Post Office will write to Messrs Bridgerton and Jones to reiterate the offer of a meeting and provide information relating to some of their concerns, agree that you would like to meet James R. Bothnott as discussed in the meeting, confirm whether or not you would like officials and or the Post Office to attend, decide whether you'd like to write to Sir Anthony Hooper, agree that you should write to the Prime Minister following your meeting with James R. Bothnott. I just want to explore the last of those, please, by looking at paragraph 9 of the note, which is over the page. Ms Thompson says, following your meeting with Mr R. Bothnott and, if appropriate, Sir Anthony, we recommend that you should write to the Prime Minister to set out your assessment of the situation and the government's position, having, quote, got to the bottom of the matter, to use his words. I think they're the words that he used, excuse me, in PMQs.
Yes.
We strongly recommend that the government comes to an agreed position and ideally should communicate whether it will take any action. We advise that the priority should be to put this issue to bed. Continued uncertainty and allegation does damage to the Post Office's business and prevents those individuals with cases from reaching a resolution. We'll provide further advice on this and propose that your office sends a short note of the meeting to the Private Secretary at number 10. What did you think to this suggestion that you should write to the Prime Minister to set out your assessment of the situation, having got to the bottom of the matter?
Well, I think I had two concerns about this. One was I wasn't sure I'd yet got to the bottom of the matter. And the second is it's not really appropriate for a Parliamentary Under Secretary of State to write to the Prime Minister. I'm not sure that's... perhaps Ms Thompson didn't really know that. That's something that would go through the Secretary of State or the Secretary of State's office.
And so for those two reasons, did you ignore the suggestion?
So I said, I'm sure I didn't agree to it, although it comes back because they then produce a draft and it takes days on end to go round through lots of different people and then comes back to me to sign off, or just look at anyway, but it's not my note. So clearly the Prime Minister had been involved at PNQs, so it's not unreasonable that number 10, there should be feedback to number 10. But certainly I wasn't in a position to write saying I got to the bottom of it, and more important, it would have been a first time that somebody, Parliamentary Under Secretary, had kind of written to a Prime Minister, on a business issue from their department. That seemed to me to be not what normally happens. So
there was a protocol or convention issue, but then there was an issue of substance.
There was substance and protocol which came together, which means I, in your words, probably for that time ignored paragraph 9.
Thank you. I think it's right that the next step in the chronology that can come down, thank you, is essentially the provision of the Second Sight Part 2 report to you towards the end of July. And can we look at some material that relates to that? UKGI 405133. And can we start by looking at page 3, please? And if we scroll down, please. Thank you. And we'll see Mr. Warmington's email in his familiar font of the 22nd of July 2015 to George Freeman. You're not copied in at this time. The subject is Second Sight's briefing report part 2. And he says, Mr. Warmington, I'm puzzled and not a little distressed by your summarisation in your recent email to Ian Warren. There's no need to look at that. And more importantly to Parliament, we're not going to look at that either, of my firm's interim and part 2 report. There were, in fact, 3 reports. You've summarised our reports with the following words. Second Sight have produced 2 independent reports in 2013 and 15, both of which demonstrate that there is no evidence of systemic flaws within the Horizon system which could cause the issues reported. That is not a correct statement. I respectfully draw your attention to paragraphs, and then he lists some of the report, and to the following additional paragraphs, and then he lists some. You may have noted from reading our reports and also from Post Office's rebuttal documents that Post Office has continually focused attention on the system itself, i.e. Horizon and Horizon Online, and even more narrowly on the software rather than the entirety of the operational platform used by its sub-postmasters. It follows that even if there had never been any systemic flaws in either version of the system, that being a contention with which we do not agree, that would not mean that the operational platform as a whole was always fit for purpose for all of the tens of thousands of users. As we stated in our report, it was not. I've attached here a copy of our briefing report, part 2. And then scroll down, I'm available at any time. So he is attaching the part 2 briefing report. He is drawing specific attention to some paragraphs within it. If we go back to page 3, please. Thank you. And in the middle of the page, we can see an email from Andrew Bridgen MP to Andrew Smith, your private secretary. Is that right?
Yes.
Please see that the email below reaches the Minister as it contradicts statements made by the Post Office. And then if we scroll up, please. Mr. Smith, forwards the chain to Laura Thompson. You'll see that it CCs the same email address as he's sending it from. Is there something that we're missing there as to why that would be done?
No. I think it might be to do with if you've got an attachment, if you copy it, is it retained or something? That's still the private office address.
Okay.
So it's not an address I've got access to.
No. And then scroll up, please. We can see that Miss Thompson replies to Mr. Smith. One, Ron Warmington has emailed George Freeman regarding Second Sight's report. Mr. Warmington states he disagrees with the summary that Second Sight's report demonstrates no evidence of systemic flaws within the Horizon system, which could cause the issues reported by applicants to the mediation scheme. He directs the Minister to several paragraphs in the final report, which he feels demonstrates that Horizon, in the totality of the user experience, is flawed. And then if we scroll down, 3, I would emphasise that our position is not to arbitrate in this matter. It's a commercial matter for the Post Office. As shareholder, we expect the Post Office to operate commercially and to handle operational and legal matters, such as this one, without government intervention. 4, following the email, we've looked again at the paragraphs he has highlighted. The statement that there is no evidence of systemic flaws within the Horizon system remains correct. That does appear to be arbitrating. This is a position we've stated repeatedly, including in Parliament, so it's unclear why Second Sight are choosing to raise this now. We're happy to provide further detail on the points raised if ministers require. So how would you have read this kind of commentary from Laura Thompson on the Second Sight report that was being sent through to you?
Well, I'm not sure whether I saw it at that time, although I certainly saw it later in the month and had a look at those paragraph numbers. I'd got concerned by that time, which is why I wanted to have a policy meeting to discuss what we should do about all of this. And that's what happened on the 4th of August. I'm not sure I've got a lot to add. I mean, we can talk about the Second Sight report if you want, here or later. I mean, they referred to all these paragraphs. If you go through those particular paragraphs, it doesn't bring out nearly as clearly as the session I had with MPs what the issues were, particularly if you're not technical. You read through and you look at all those different paragraphs, and then you look at the poll response, which is even longer.
The 83 rebuttal.
And comes back on it. And to be honest, for somebody who's not expert and not meant to be expert, it's actually quite confusing. And it was that, so I've got this milling about. Obviously, you've got somebody writing in saying that what Freeman had been advised to say looked, I think they were actually saying was misleading, which is obviously a serious matter. So for me, I wanted to try and find a way through, but obviously the advice that I'm getting here is stay at arm's length. We haven't got any reason to think that our advice is wrong, that the Second Sight report demonstrated no evidence of systemic flaws within the Horizon system.
When did you receive the second Sight report?
I'm not convinced I saw it before that meeting of the 4th of... I mean, I may have been aware of it. What normally happens with the box is you read the top papers, and if you've got time or reason, you might read some of the annexes. It's one of the things that you try to explain to civil servants, actually, when I found, because I've had these different jobs, both inside and outside, is the key points need to be in the covering memo. And so Warmington's covering memo was helpful because a couple of the key points came out. But I don't think I actually read the full report until later in the month, and you will recall that I then, Mr. McInnes sent me a memo saying, well, there's nothing new here, and I asked for further advice, hoping that I would get further advice on the detailed allegations in the Second Sight report, which at the time I didn't get. I got another note from the post office.
So just dealing with the extent of your reading in of the Second Sight report, can we look, please, at UKGI 405504? And we're skipping ahead in the chronology a little here, but it's because of what is said in the body of the email. If we scroll down to the second email down, there's an email from you to Mr. Warmington, from your office to Mr. Warmington, of the 14th of August. And you say in the second line, last two words, I have read with interest your, quote, Part 2 briefing report, as well as the response from Post Office Limited. Was that correct, that by this time, the 14th of August, you had read the Second Sight report and Post Office's 83-page rebuttal?
I've certainly looked through it, and later on, I think I say I've kind of looked through it. It's convention that if somebody writes to you as a minister and they send you a report, it happens all the time, they send you a report on accident statistics or procurement, then you write back saying, I've read with interest, this is a standard reply, I've read with interest your report. And in this case, I've mentioned the two reports. That will have been drafted for me by officials of some kind, and I have no reason not to quote it in a conventional way. So it's not that I wasn't aware of the Second Sight report and was aware that it got important things in it. But the idea, it's perhaps slightly misleading, the idea that I would have been on top of all of it. But what I have said is they've committed to addressing them and making improvements, and they're on training, which of course I think they had done. But obviously I've stuck to the line of the parties involved. But behind the scenes, you will know that I'd asked Tim Parker to, do some sort of independent investigation of all of it, which Second Sight would be at the heart. And
so just focusing at the moment then on the extent to which you read Second Sight's Part 2 briefing report. In your witness statement, you tell us that you would have read the report, or at least the passages which Mr. Warmington had listed.
Yeah.
And I don't suppose you can remember which is the case.
Well, I certainly read the passages which are listed, and those are the ones I was commenting on, that if you go through them, you don't get quite the same tonality as if you read the whole report from beginning to end. And then, of course, you turn to the poll response, and you're actually confused as to what you need. So, I mean, to some extent, I think you have to understand. I was concerned about this. There wasn't that much I could personally do in terms of getting on top of this. I therefore wanted to make sure that a proper piece of work was done on this, what eventually became the Swift report.
The Second Sight Part 2 briefing report, in summary, finds that some form of unauthorised remote access may have occurred, that amounts in excess of £100,000 had been taken into post offices' profit and loss accounts, that the post office operated contracts to the detriment of sub-postmasters and provided them with no automatic entitlement to data upon which properly to judge whether or not they were liable for the losses alleged against them, and that some prosecutions appear to have been focused more on debt recovery than in the interest of justice.
And that comes out very well from the Swift report, which summarises, which I only saw when I was preparing for this hearing, summarises it very well. But at that time, I had asked ShEx for advice on this, you may recall. So I'd said, I'd like some advice, please. And I had then been sent a memo by Mr. McInnes, which repeated the usual mantra and didn't go into the details. So I never actually got proper briefing on that report. And I don't think it's unreasonable for a minister to ask officials to look at and summarise something of that importance, particularly as it turns out they'd had it for about a year. So presumably they could and should have read it in great detail. And when I asked for an analysis of it, I actually should have had an analysis of it. But I didn't get that. And so I then moved on and accelerated the work being done by the new chair of the Post Office.
Do I take it from that, Baroness Neville-Rolfe, that your reading of either the report or the identified paragraphs in the report didn't highlight to you that what you had been consistently told by Laura Thompson and others, that second report had revealed no systemic problems with Horizon?
I think there is unfortunately I haven't got it with me, but I think there is a reference somewhere, because what was done by Paul and perhaps by ShEx was to pick up from the work that the Second Sight had done, this sort of magic sentence that there wasn't a systemic flaw. Mm-hmm. But actually there were lots of other things in the report, like the fact that obviously they'd had a really crummy foreign currency scheme, which ended up losing money either for the unfortunate postmaster or indeed for the post office itself. It's not too clear. So there was these various different points in those reports which I didn't have the time or the expertise to really look at properly. And what they seemed to be just doing was repeating this mantra that Second Sight was fine and they'd gone native and we should just ignore that report. And I didn't really like that approach to things. But I have to say, I think perhaps Second Sight, they weren't experienced, they weren't lobbyists, they hadn't brought out into the front of the report in a way that might have helped them a bit more, the key things that you have now summarised so beautifully, and as counsel to the inquiry. They didn't do that. But the MPs had talked to them, and they did bring out strongly exactly these points that were actually quite well summarised in the note from Paul of the meeting that I had, which obviously wasn't an official note.
You tell us in your witness statement, it's paragraph 88, that you received a briefing note from Laura Thompson. Can we look at that, please? UKGI 401067. Going back a little bit to the 31st of July, but it's a passage that I want to pick up. And if we scroll down, please. And again, yes, 6. Individuals who have a criminal conviction already have a suitable independent route of appeal through the courts or the CCRC. This is the appropriate course of action for those individuals to take if they feel their convictions are unsafe. And then over the page. Yes, nothing else on that. The briefing note appears to be advising you not to interfere in cases where there had been criminal convictions, because that was a matter for the CCRC and the courts. What was your view on that aspect of the advice that you were receiving?
Well, obviously, the line that I should respect the CCRC, who at that, were well, I think were well viewed at that time, seemed to me to be a reasonable one, especially as I've been told including a letter from their general counsel that they weren't, withholding any papers. Which actually turned out to be untrue. When you eventually read the Swift report, you find there were sort of Deloitte papers and things which I was completely unaware of, which other people hadn't had. And so the CCRC should be allowed to get on with it. Seemed to be not an unreasonable point. Having said that, and obviously they were the particular population I was worried about, but equally there were these points by Second Sight that have been raised about how what seems to have been happening was the post office had an awful lot of lines for a poor sub-postmaster in a small rural post office. And so it was really, really important that Horizon worked properly when they, had to deal with all of these things. And the Second Sight report is quite good, and it takes you through all these different lines and explains the difficulties. Now, if you've got a really good IT system and really good IT support, you can bring online new products. And people who are selling them, can be ushered into making it work. But the Second Sight report suggested that there were some wider problems. And we kept being told there weren't systemic problems, but there were obviously, bugs and the odd problems, as you could see from what the MPs were telling me, and indeed from the Second Sight report, if you could find the right bits.
Can we turn back to your witness statement?
I'm sorry, does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Can we turn back to your witness statement, please? And page 34. In fact, if we start at page 30. Page 30. Paragraph 110, you say, I did feel at this stage, and that's mid-August 2015, that I was fighting ShEx. And then if we go forwards, please, to page 34. You say, by this time I had lost confidence in the quality of ShEx advice. We were going round in circles. They were unwilling to engage with the issues in the way I felt they needed to. In my view, ShEx had lost objectivity, and its officials were unable or unwilling to scrutinise Post Office properly, even though that was an essential part of their role. The advice they gave seemed closed-minded, deaf to the issues, and constantly repeating the same mantra. As time went by, I felt as though they were trying to obstruct or shut down my efforts to get to grips with the issues. this may have been connected in some way to a dogmatic belief that arm's-length bodies should be entirely free of government interference. Certainly I was repeatedly advised that the Post Office should be left alone. I do recall feeling the pressure of the consistent advice from ShEx that these were not matters for government and to hold that official line. But based on what I now knew, that was no longer a tenable position. Had this happened in your either civil service or political career to date, i.e. by mid-August 2015, the officials that were advising you were fighting you, they had lost objectivity, they seemed closed-minded?
I mean, the answer is no. I mean, I did deal with the Green Investment Bank, and funnily enough, that was ShEx as well, although a different caste list, where we had a problem of trying to reassure people that green credentials would sort of not be completely lost. And the advice there was, it was privatization, so that was tough. And eventually we found a solution, which was to bring in trustees who were slightly outside the structure and, you know, could be turned to in the event of, I think, an onward sale or whatever. But to start with, I'd found ShEx quite difficult on that subject, although we did get a resolution to that in the end. But on the whole, you know, if you're clear that you want something, I mean, the other thing that officials do is go to the Permanent Secretary or go to the Secretary of State. And to some extent, obviously, there was this understanding that there was operational separation, and that certainly had the endorsement of the Secretary of State. But I probably would have mentioned my frustrations, but the way I dealt with the frustration, rightly or wrongly, I wanted to do something, was I moved forward and I got the new chairman to take a look at this. I explained that it was, you know, reputationally and organisationally important for the Post Office, and I encouraged him, my recollection is I encouraged him actually to use a lawyer, a QC, because that's what the sort of thing that I had experience of in the private sector, where you've got a really big problem. If you bring in an independent leading member of your profession, they provide clarity, they make sure you know what the facts are, and then that enables you to move forward and do the right thing. But if what you're asking me about was, what had I lost confidence in ShEx advice, the honest truth I tried at an earlier junction to get some business department officials to come along to a meeting, and they sent a lawyer. So I had a lawyer and I had 2 special advisors at the meeting, but I didn't have, you know, a senior business department official who I felt might be a little bit more understanding of the fact that you've got MPs. I mean, MPs are really important in our democracy because they sometimes bring, you know, they bring unwelcome bits of information to you. I wasn't an MP, but I was at a major retailer. We had the same system. You've got these letters coming into the CEO, which were an excellent source of stones in the shoe, and that's what we were getting from these MPs. And I didn't feel that ShEx really wanted to listen to that. They wanted to make sure that the line that they took prevailed, and they worked with Paul to try and make sure that that's, you know, what I was being told. And then I brought in Oliver Letwin, C para 125, which was obviously helpful.
If we skip forwards to paragraph 239 on page 61, please. You say, my relationship was mainly with, excuse me, Laura Thompson, who was for the most part hard-working, helpful and effective. However, she followed party lines decided above her by Richard Callard, the Post Office board member, and others. In retrospect, ShEx was too close to the Post Office for effective scrutiny, and I was at times frustrated by their unwillingness to question the state of status quo. Who within ShEx did you have concerns about by reference to the words and others?
Well, I didn't see much of Richard Callard, but to the extent I did have a little bit of concern about him, and clearly we have had evidence separately that he was working very closely to Paul, which I mean is understandable. He was on their board. And then I had this exchange with Mr. McInnes, who I think was I don't know where he slotted in, but maybe above Callard. And I'd asked him specifically for a proper submission on Second Sight. And I ended up not getting a reply from him at all, but getting a reply from Laura Thompson saying the same thing and forwarding a piece of paper from Poll, Annex B, which was missing when I saw all these papers initially.
What was the nature of your interactions with Mr. Callard?
I think he came to the meeting at the beginning of August. I met him when I went on the away day in June because he was the board member.
Did you communicate your concerns directly to Mr. Callard?
Well, certainly on the 4th of August, I communicated my concerns. And he saw, the thing about the civil service is there's a lot of reading of paper. And civil servants are very good at reading paper. And he was receiving copies of all the exchanges I was having with Laura Thompson, who knew of my concerns. I mean, one difficulty we've got, and I now know why, is that we haven't got any notes of my meetings by my private secretaries except where they ended up somewhere else. And one of the documents you just flashed up says it's not the responsibility of private office to keep any copies, it's the responsibility of the divisions. So that's the problem we've got. Sorry, I'm not really answering the question, but those were the concerns I had. I think I had one meeting with Mr. Russell, who was the top honcho, and that was later on. I think he came to see me to ask about how I'd found ShEx.
Given the concerns that you have mentioned in the passages of your witness statement that I've shown to you, in particular that ShEx was being obstructive, that you had lost confidence in it, that it lacked objectivity, what steps did you take to address those issues?
Well, the main step I took was to ask the new chairman of the post office to bring in an independent person to have a good look at the whole thing and provide us with advice. And then I pushed back on ShEx in the normal way, where they gave me advice that I didn't like. But, you know, they were the officials. I had a go at the beginning of August at bringing in officials from elsewhere, but I was told that, and remember I was relatively junior minister, I was told that, you know, that wasn't appropriate. I mean, I did have updates with, quite short updates always, with the Secretary of State, and I'm sure I know I explained to him that I was planning this review by Parker, obviously who he was partly responsible for bringing in, which my recollection was he supported.
Was that Sajid Javid?
Yeah.
Did you ever consider, escalating might not be the right word, but raising the problems that you were encountering with the Permanent Secretary?
The honest truth is I can't remember, but if I had had a meeting with the Permanent Secretary, which I did occasionally have at that time, I'm sure I would have said, well, it's all very frustrating, but what we're going to do is we've got these 2 or 3 avenues, we're going to add the extra avenue of having an independent look at it by Parker, and he would have probably agreed that was a good idea. You have to remember that I try to be constructive. I try to actually do something, which was why I got this extra piece of work done, which I think, if it had become public, would have been extremely transformational.
Given your concern that the party line was being decided by individuals, including Mr. Callard, did you consider it was appropriate for Mr. Callard to have been the government's representative on the board?
I mean, that was not a decision for me. My understanding of the structure was I was responsible for postal affairs, but who, how the shareholder executive worked. And, the permanent secretaries, I think, sit on the top co in the shareholder executive, and it's for them to decide, who the individuals are. It is important who the individuals are, but it's not part of the Constitution that we as ministers, decide which civil servants have which jobs. And when that works well, that's fine.
Which permanent secretary had functional responsibility for ShEx?
Well, that will have been the business permanent secretary, who I think it was first Martin Donnelly and then it became Alex Chisholm, but I think that was Alex came in with the climate change and energy work, which was the time I was moved. So I think Martin Donnelly would have been the perm sec at that time.
Thank you.
And I did have meetings with him on European issues quite a lot, because and one of the points I haven't made is that obviously, although the post office is very important to me, I was quite heavily occupied on other matters, notably going to Brussels probably once or twice a month. I think I was in Asia in this summer period on intellectual property. And, that was the most important, those plus the bills were the most important part of my portfolio. Important though this obviously is.
You've referred to having a meeting at the beginning of August with Paula Vennells. Can we look, please, at UKGI 405261? And if we scroll to the foot of the page, please. This is an email exchange not including you, and is in the run-up to the meeting. The subject heading is Sparrow Catch-Up. It's dated the 4th of August, 2015. From Mr. Callard to Aven O'Farrell, who is, or was, Paula Vennells' essentially personal assistant. We had a catch-up with Lady Neville-Rolfe today about Sparrow. Paula is seeing her on Thursday morning, that will be the 6th, first thing-ish. And I thought it might be worthwhile me having a chat with Paula for 5 minutes over the phone tomorrow if there's time. I appreciate it's her first day back, but if we could find a slot, it's worth her being aware of Lady Neville-Rolfe's mood and position. Not that there's too much to worry about. Can we look, please, at your witness statement at paragraph 102? Which is on page 27. Page 27. Foot of the page. You say, I've been shown a copy of a chain of emails. That's the one I've just shown you. And then fourth line, of course, I did not see these emails at the time. And then you start quoting from the email. And if we go over the page, please. You say, I find this troubling. This seems to me to be clear evidence that ShEx, whose role it was to provide me and other ministers with objective and impartial advice, to scrutinise Pol's actions and to hold it to account, was taking steps to provide advance warning to Post Office about my concerns and intended direction of travel. I cannot see any good reason for them to have done so. I'm sadly driven to the conclusion that ShEx and Post Office, perhaps inadvertently, were in effect working together to try to deflect me, and that ShEx were not giving me the independent and impartial advice that I needed. What was it about the communication between Richard Callard and Paula Vennells' office that led you to that conclusion?
And I think he and Laura knew that by that time I was getting frustrated and wanted more done than this classic post office line. And so he seems to be ringing them up, say, well, there's a meeting coming up, and, as it were, telling them in advance where I was going to come from so that they could prepare for that. That took the element of kind of surprise away from my meeting with Vennells. So instead of being able to take on Vennells, they would obviously pre-brief Vennells, the communications director, who's an ex-special advisor, will have obviously explained everything that she should do. And I didn't really think, given there was a difference between us and the post office at that time, that was a very sensible or wise thing to do. I mean, it is true, sort of prime ministers have Sherpas that talk to each other before meetings, but, you know, that's where things are, you know, there's more agreement coming along, whereas actually, you know, this was a slightly rocky patch, and I think that showed a lack of judgment and a wish to be perhaps more aligned with the post office than was appropriate. But obviously, Mr. Callard had these two conflicting. He was trying to be a good Ned to the post office, and he was also trying to advise me. So I can perhaps understand it from that point of view, but I think it was misjudged, and it made me feel slightly that those who were advising me had a foot in the post office camp. And it was one of the reasons why, as I alluded to earlier, I wondered if we shouldn't have some more classic civil service officials. Because you remember that ShEx is very much made up of commercial people. Richard came from Deloitte. You know, they're all a series of people who've come in from the public sector, private sector, which of course I understand. But it does mean that they're not so au fait with these political difficulties, which we were obviously facing. At this time.
Why did you consider that ShEx and the Post Office were working together was perhaps inadvertent? Working together to try and deflect you was perhaps inadvertent?
Well, I was trying to. Obviously, I don't have evidence except the evidence that you've given me in those pieces of paper, and you know, they're civil servants. They try to act with objectivity. That's why I put perhaps inadvertently. As it is, I think, during the course of your inquiry, this thing that I wrote some weeks ago has become a little more believable.
So thank you. We're about to move to a separate topic. Could we break until 25:02, please?
Yes.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Baroness. Neville-Rolfe. Can we just go back, assuming, sir, you can see and hear us?
That is a correct assumption.
Thank you very much. Can we go back, please, to the tipping off or priming of Paula Vennells and her staff about your concerns, your mood and your position in advance of the meeting? We looked at that email before the break, and you expressed your concerns about it. Can we look, please, at UKGI 401067? We've looked at this note before, but I want to ask you a couple of questions about a different issue. It's from Laura Thompson to you of the 31st of July, and you'll see that it refers under purpose to ahead of our discussion with you and Nick King on Tuesday the 4th of August, and timing to see ahead of our meeting on Tuesday the 4th of August. And then under 1, since we spoke to you earlier this week, we've been exploring options to address the concerns you raised. And then this, we've also been engaging with Post Office at a senior level to ensure that they are aware of your views. Reading that sentence, engaging at a senior level to ensure they're aware of your views, would you understand that that's a reference to the forewarning of Paula Vennells of your mood and position in the way that we saw in the email that we looked at before the break?
Well, I think it's a completely fair point that they did say that. I don't recall that at the time. And it says aware of your views, so I suppose that's fair enough. It doesn't resolve, obviously it depends what the exchanges were, it doesn't quite resolve the problem that I was looking for independent advice, and they knew that because my private office had been on to them saying that I wanted somebody outside ShEx to come to the meeting.
But the point that we take from this, would this be right, is that at least ShEx were being open with you about the fact of communication over, quote, your views with Post Office at a senior level. It wasn't surreptitious.
That's true, from that note, yeah.
But do I detect that you retain a residual concern, having read the email exchange between Richard Callard and Paula Vennells' staff?
I retain a residual concern, yes.
Can we turn to the separate issue that can come down? Thank you. You've mentioned it a number of times already, the wish to have separate or independent advice, i.e. separate from ShEx. Can we turn to your witness statement, please? It's paragraph 99. Which is on page 26. Page 26. '99 is at the foot of the page. You say, I'd agreed with, to a meeting with Paula Vennells and Jane McLeod on the 6th of August. As explained by this stage, I was dissatisfied with the advice I was receiving from ShEx, and I wanted a senior official outside ShEx to provide support. On 3rd of August, my private secretary communicated to Laura Thompson my request for support from a senior official from outside of ShEx at this meeting. So here you appear to be saying that the request was for a senior official outside of ShEx to provide you with support at the meeting with Paula Vennells and Jane McLeod on the 6th of August, correct?
Well, my recollection was the main occasion on which I wanted someone from outside was on the 4th of August meeting, because we were trying to look forward at options.
Got it.
But I think the private office, perhaps rightly, it was a long time ago, took that as meaning that it would be good to have somebody there on the 6th August meeting. I mean, I think there might be the conflation of the two meetings. Not sure that detail matters. It was more that I was hoping to have a different pair of eyes on the issues.
Can I just persist with the detail modestly for a moment by looking at the email, because I think you may be right in what you're saying, that the independent assistance was for the purposes of the meeting on the 4th, not the 6th. UKGI 405195. Can we look, please? This is the correspondence that you cited in paragraph 99 of your witness statement. And if we look at page 2 first, please, and scroll down. An email from Laura Thompson to your private office. Please see attached a short note to the Minister ahead of our meeting with her on the Tuesday. So Tuesday would have been the 4th of August. And then if we scroll up, please. Revised notes sent through. First page, please, at the foot of the page. And scroll a bit more, please. Thank you. Your private secretary replies to Laura Thompson. Thank you for the note which you had seen. You were looking forward to the discussion at Tuesday's meeting to ensure this meeting was as valuable as possible. She commented that it was very helpful to have Nick King. A lawyer would need to be involved. Keen to have a list of the senior officials that would attend. Grateful if you could advise on who should be invited from legal on C. I understand Richard Callard and Anthony Odgers will attend. The Minister is still keen that a senior official outside of ShEx be involved, given that part of this discussion is a policy one that may go beyond BIS's shareholder role. I'd be grateful for your steer on how we can address this. I'd like to go back to the Minister on this point this afternoon. And then at the top of the page, an email from Laura to Richard. Just spoke to Harriet. She thinks Baroness Neville-Rolfe still wants a senior official outside of ShEx and not including whoever we get from legal, but is going to go back with the proposal of just 3 plus legal and see what the Minister says. I asked Harriet to emphasise that we are taking the policy view, not just the shareholder view. So it would appear from your private secretary's email that the request from you was to have somebody from outside of ShEx present at the meeting on the 4th, i.e. the internal meeting on the 4th, is that right?
That's right. But
rather than the meeting with Post Office on the 6th.
But I only got half a loaf. I got a legal department person and I got a more senior person from ShEx and I got special advisor. And
so leaving aside the detail point then, getting back to the point of substance, why did you request the support of a senior official outside of ShEx for your meeting on the 4th of August? Because, as I explained in my statement, by then I was beginning to worry about the advice that I was getting from ShEx, which is very, very much a single track, everything is fine, and I was seriously concerned about the sort of points that the MPs who I met had been making. And I felt that something extra needed to be done so that the things we got, which were the CCRC, the mediation, the SS report, were not enough and that we needed to do something extra. And I thought that somebody from outside ShEx would be more open to that. Do you know why your request was denied? I suspect it might be partly to do with the fact that it was August and probably nobody was around. You know, got the cock-up theory of history. But also, they obviously felt strongly that they were going to do the policy view as well as the shareholder view. And, you know, when you're a government minister, you know, you have to fight the battles you have to fight. And we were nearly at the time of the meeting, and it was important that the meeting should go ahead rather than wait to have, you know, sort of going round the office politics was not what I wanted to do. What I wanted to do was to actually get something done. And so you attended the meeting in the end without the I'd called, independent advice? I'd called the meeting. I wanted that meeting to happen before the August break. I wanted to get on with it and make sure that something was done. Can we turn to the meeting on the 6th of August with Paula Vennells by looking at your witness statement, please. Page 27. paragraph 100, you tell us that in advance of the meeting, ShEx provided you with a briefing note and lines to take, which they drafted and which didn't reflect your concerns at the time nor your intended direction of travel. You say, I did not want to be told yet again about Post Office's side of the story. What I wanted to ensure was that there would be a fresh and independent review to see if issues with Horizon had been missed. 101, you say the department has been unable, regrettably, to locate any minutes or other record of the meeting of the 6th of August. Skipping a few lines, you say, whilst I cannot recall whether I said in the meeting that you thought that a QC-led or similar independent review should be commissioned, you may not have done as you hadn't yet spoken to Tim Parker. Referring to a letter 4 lines from the bottom, you say this does seem to suggest I highlighted at the meeting the concerns raised by MPs previously, including that postmasters felt insulted by Post Office's approach to mediation. I do recall finding one of the Post Office's attendees to be particularly overbearing and dismissive of my concerns. And who was that?
I think it was either Mr. Davis or Mr. Bourke. I haven't got photos of them, but what I found was that when I made points and made them to Paula Vennells, there was quite a lot of interrupting by them, giving their view of things. And obviously I was trying to have a meeting with Paula Vennells to hear her views and not have the sort of insistent line of these people who were kind of supporting her in this matter. I don't know whether it was the General Counsel. She was obviously there as well. I mean, she might have intervened. Just my memory of that meeting was that it was, sort of almost, there was a sort of threatening feel that I was trying to do the wrong thing and, I should watch out. It was just, I said, overbearing and dismissive of my concerns. I was passing on concerns that had been registered by people, the democratic representatives, and I felt that they wanted to tell me what they thought the thing was, rather than, explain why the detail of some of these points wasn't right. I mean, they sent me there was a big PowerPoint pack of stuff, some of which is extremely helpful, like the detail on mediation and things. So, it wasn't all negative, but there was just this memory, and I was encouraged to put this in, that I'd kind of felt slightly threatened at the meeting.
From the Post Office side, what is your recollection as to who led for them? Was it Ms. Vennells or somebody else?
Well, Ms. Vennells led, but she got interrupted by other people when questions were asked. Often, if you're the leader at a meeting, you make the points, you have a speaking note, and then you bring your people in as and when you feel that would be helpful. It didn't feel like that. It felt the other way around.
Thank you. Can we turn to paragraph 103 of your witness statement, please? Which is just over the page. You say you recall speaking to Tim Parker, probably later on that same day, the 6th of August. And you impressed on him that he needed to ensure that the Horizon issues were looked at again and taken seriously. I just wanted this sorted out properly and believe he would realise that he and the other board members had a duty to just that. I recall asking him to bring in an independent QC or equivalent to head a review when he took up office, and he moved to do so soon after he took office. You understand that the department doesn't hold a record of that call. So by this time you knew that early August, that Mr. Parker was to take up the chairmanship of the Post Office.
Yes.
And you spoke to him and impressed on him the things that you set out there. Why did you think that Mr. Parker was the solution or a solution to the outstanding issue or issues?
Because he was the new chairman of the Post Office. He had a background which combined business experience, I think clerk, Samsonite, various things. I mean, he was a strong candidate for this job. And the National Trust, which is sort of more public sector kind of thing. And I think he was a Treasury official when he started in his life, because I had briefly interviewed him early on in my time as a minister, because when new appointments are being made to boards, it's classic that the people who come through the system, through the panel, then sort of have a cup of tea with the minister before the final appointment is made. And I have to say, I was quite impressed by him. I thought he had a sort of strength and dynamism, and he seemed, when I spoke to him, to very much want to get to the heart of all of this. And I knew from my experience of running boards that if you have a sort of running saw like this, bringing in somebody from outside, like a QC, or it can be a senior civil servant, or I think somebody had suggested a captain of industry, which I think probably would work less well, then that was the thing to do. And it was also a route to actually getting something done.
Can we look, please, at poll 0010 2551? This is your letter to Mr. Parker of the 10th of September 2015, so about a month later. And you say, I'm writing to you ahead of your taking up the role of Post Office Chairman to confirm our conversation last month regarding Horizon. The issues surrounding Horizon have not been resolved. Indeed, some of the MPs concerned have written to me again following the Panorama programme, pressing the case for an independent investigation. The government takes seriously the concerns raised by individuals and MPs regarding the Horizon system and the suggestions there may have been miscarriages of justice, and also recognises the commitment that Post Office have demonstrated to resolving those issues, including through creating a mediation scheme and appointing independent investigators to scrutinise the system. You'll be aware there have been some 3 years of scrutiny of Horizon, and the CCRC is considering a number of cases which have been brought to it by individuals. The government cannot intervene in that independent process. As the sole shareholder, the government wants to make sure that the Post Office network is successful and sustainable across the country. We recognise it's a commercial business, and we want to allow it, we allow it to operate as such, but of course we expect it to behave fairly and responsibly in doing so. I'm therefore requesting that on your assuming your role as chair, you give this matter your earliest attention, and if you determine that any further action is necessary, we'll take steps to ensure that happens. Over the page, I look forward to hearing your conclusions and to working with you to secure the future of the Post Office network. Would you agree this letter did not specify how Tim Parker should carry out any review or investigation into the issues, whether it was to be conducted by him or somebody else, and if by somebody else, the nature or qualifications of that person?
I agree that it leaves it open. The letter was, of course, drafted by ShEx for me.
Yes.
And I do recall the circumstances. A whole package came up. I think they'd all been cleared through the Secretary of State by the time they got to me, or anyway, certainly by the time I was signing this. I think the letter could have added in something about deadlines, something about publicity, one or two other things, but it's very much written from a ShEx perspective, respecting the ALB character. And I think that actually that balance is probably quite sensible, because if they were concerned, which they always were, about the commercial operation being separate, but I had a lot of faith in a new chair coming in who I thought would take a really good and strong look at this, talk to those concerned, do the sort of forensic work that wasn't appropriate for a minister to do, and I wouldn't even have had time for it. And that the letter, confirmed that that is what I'd asked him to do.
Can we look, please, at poll 0023-3179? This is an email exchange that you weren't party to. If we scroll down, that's the email from Roderick Williams, a lawyer in Post Office, to Patrick Bulk and Mark Underwood in Post Office. And he says, see my starter for 10 on Jane's speaking notes for her meeting with Tim Parker. So this is ahead of a proposed meeting between Jane MacLeod, then General Counsel of Post Office, and Tim Parker, who would then, by then, be Post Office Chairman. And if you just look at number 3, the review will, however, be creditable if it is undertaken independently from the existing Post Office team, logical in its approach, and delivered against stated objectives. What would you say to the suggestion that the idea of independence, namely a review undertaken by Queen's Counsel or similar, came from Post Office and not you?
I mean, I think when I suggested the thing, I was most keen on having some independence. I don't think I laid down specifically that it should be a QC, because there were other options, such as a senior civil servant or, as I said, a captain of industry. But the key thing was to bring somebody in so that there was an independence from existing PO teams. So I agree with Ed, to be honest. That seems to me a very fair point. And without sparing your blushes, if you bring in a QC, they will do a thorough job, and that it will be objective and that the facts will be correct, and that they're quite good at marshalling lots of different pieces of paper and summarising things in a way that's understandable. And actually, I would say that the Swift review, when I eventually saw it, did a lot of those things. So I was entirely in agreement with Tim Parker and delighted when he wrote to me very soon after his start date, saying that was what he was going to do. And Sir Jonathan Swift, who's now, I think, a High Court judge, seemed an up-and-coming and very talented person to do exactly what I felt needed to be done, and could be done, at reasonable speed, and then we could get on and do something which wouldn't take many years.
If we just look over the page, please, at paragraph 6. Given the volume of material, Tim Parker is likely to need, quote, independent professional assistance. Subject to any procedural requirements, this could be a solicitor with good document management and summarising skills from a firm which hasn't been instructed by the Post Office and which is on the Government Services panel if we want preferential rates, completely off panel if we want total independence, a barrister likely to have a high level of independence, tend to be focused on forensics and outcomes rather than process, a management consultant likely to be good at understanding of the process but may not be able to opine on the suitability of the process or focus on whether there's a better one, or a former civil servant. Again, did the idea of independent professional assistance come from you to Tim Parker way back on that conversation in early August?
That was very much my recollection. That was exactly what I wanted, as I say. And I reference that because of my commercial experience and knowing how helpful that can be to a board.
Can we look then at Tim Parker's reply to your letter of the 10th of September, UKGI 406138. Dear Lucy, Thank you for your letter of the 10th of September. Having had my first days of induction just last week, I'm considering how to fulfil the commitment I gave you to take a fresh look at the Post Office's handling of the complaints raised in connection with Horizon. To this end, and to promote the independence of the exercise, I propose to instruct a QC to advise me as to the appropriate scope of my investigation, how I might best conduct the necessary inquiries, and assist me in considering both how to present and, as necessary, act on my findings. That refers to a slightly different role of the QC, doesn't it? The QC is going to advise on scope, the conduct and presentation of Mr. Parker's findings, rather than conducting the investigation him or herself.
Well, that might be so, but equally, when we eventually had the summary letter later on explaining what he'd covered, it seemed to me to cover the right area. You have to put a certain amount of trust in a highly paid chairman to a government ALB, and, you know, bringing in a QC to advise seemed a good idea, and there's no suggestion that he's sort of just leaving it to the QC, actually to assist me in considering both how to present and, as necessary, act on my findings. I mean, actually, I think that's a positive rather than a negative, if I'm honest. I didn't have a concern at the time. I felt a certain weight off my shoulders that we were going to actually bring in somebody different. And of course, you have to remember that we have an inquiry with hindsight. We did not know at the time that there had been these unsafe prosecutions. Everybody was telling me that Horizon was fine, that it was all fine. I was having to tell officials who didn't like the idea that we were opening up, possible criticisms of them. They didn't like the idea that things might have gone wrong. I had to remind them that we, as government, had to try to make sure the right thing was done.
And so, looking at the episode as a whole, you thought that this was positive, in that he wasn't simply outsourcing this, farming it out to a silk. The references to his involvement in it were a good thing.
They were. It's a balance. You've got the independent QC coming along and doing a proper forensic job, and then you've got the chairman following through and actually, doing what was necessary. That seemed to me what that letter said.
Thank you. So that will be an appropriate moment for the lunch break.
Yep.
We will turn next to Baroness Neville-Rolfe's meeting with Second Sight on the 19th of October 2015. Could we do that at 1:55, please?
Sure.
Thank you very much.